I am Oliver, a psychologist, and there are no paradises to escape to. Today, we will discuss the Black Swordsman, Guts. This will contain spoilers for the entire Berserk manga. Let's dive in. Guts embodies a warrior who is powerful, imposing, with a very human emotional development and an extremely tragic story. Berserk is essentially about him dealing with all of this, being impacted by other characters, and also impacting them in return. Berserk is a narrative of human relationships with various cultural, religious references, and an incredible psychological context. Miura had a deep understanding of the psychological nature of humanity. Guts' story is one of the most complex I have seen in protagonists and one of the most tragic as well. Throughout Berserk, he undergoes trauma in every arc. First, he did not have a proper parental relationship. He is born from his mother's body, who had just died, and is found by mercenaries. Shisu, Gambino's wife, sees the child and decides to save him. Guts, born without his father and mother, ends up forming a new relationship. He has his parental figures in Gambino and Shisu. However, to this mercenary, Guts was nothing more than a tool. He does not have any affection for the boy. But for the boy, it was different. Then Guts loses his mother to a disease, and his relationship with Gambino becomes more complicated. Gambino sells the boy, sells him to be abused for a night, bringing about what would be Guts' first great trauma. Shortly after, Guts kills Gambino. Guts kills Gambino out of instinct, not because he wanted to see him die. This death deeply marks the boy. The context of Gambino's death hit Guts hard. Abandonment, abuse, and the fact of harboring guilt for having killed the person closest to a father figure. As Guts himself says, "My childhood was buried in the flowers of another day's spring." The consequences of such violence directly impact the victim's physical and mental health. Humans experience traumatic events differently from other animals because we attribute meanings to the events that happen to us. The experience of fear associated with trauma will somehow reflect the meaning assigned to the event. People with post-traumatic stress disorder continue to relive that moment, both in wakeful life and in dreams, and avoid situations that remind them of memories that might recall that occasion. They might also experience a general numbing of their responsibility, show reduced interest in significant activities, restrict the range of their emotions, or have feelings of distance and alienation from others. Guts manages to escape from the mercenaries who tried to kill him because of Gambino's death, becomes a great warrior, and then catches the interest of the Band of the Hawk. And it's amazing how this changes his perspective as he starts to feel at home, accepted. He forges friendships. The Band of the Hawk represents a different setup for him. Griffith is a leader close to his subordinates. Before joining the Band of the Hawk, Guts always experienced relationships of betrayal, where weaker people were deceived by stronger ones. But the Band of the Hawk was different. There was a relationship of closeness. Here he finds people who fight alongside him. He meets the person who would become his best friend, and also the person who would be the great love of his life. His relationship with Casca is one of the most striking for me in animes, because Guts came with a traumatic childhood experience that would make him not want to be touched by anyone, and Casca becomes the person he trusts, starting to change that in him. And she is the one who prevents him from ending his own life, giving her life a new meaning. However, when he hears Griffith say that a friend to him would be someone equal, it basically excluded all his subordinates from the Band of the Hawk. Guts becomes contemplative as he feels he needs to search for something for himself. This view of Guts having his own dream is very interesting because it shows how the Band of the Hawk made Guts feel different, because before that, he had no purpose. The very fact that he questions himself shows that he was developing an awareness of his own life and that his existence could indeed have meaning. And also because, despite appearing strong, he was insecure. He leaves believing that Casca would not care about him and underestimates his value to Griffith. So Guts leaves the Band of the Hawk in search of answers. Something very characteristic of him that will, in the future, hurt him a lot. The psychologist Robert Leahy, in his book Don't Believe Everything You Feel, discusses how some internal beliefs can harm us. In this book, he shows a bit about how to deal with them and how to explore them as well. He always tries to distance himself from things instead of dealing with them. But after Guts' departure, Griffith ends up being imprisoned and tortured by the King of Midland. Guts returns to the Band of the Hawk somewhat without answers. He sees a band completely disfigured and goes to rescue a friend who is not the same as before. He finds Griffith mutilated by torture, and then this same Griffith delivers his entire band, including Guts, for a sacrifice. And then, as an act of revenge, ends up abusing Casca, Guts' great love, bringing a massive anger in him, which makes him enter a sort of Berserker syndrome. The psychologist Armin Simon published an article in the journal Psychological Reports. He argued that the Berserkers, or what he referred to as the Blind Fury Syndrome, should be included in the DSM-3 at the time. Simon described this condition as a violent and exaggerated reaction to a physical, verbal, or visual insult, amnesia during the actual period of violence, abnormally great strength, and violence specifically directed towards the target. It closely resembles what Guts feels at that moment. His anger is so intense that he doesn't notice he's losing his arm, and later loses his left eye as well. The pain. The anger and pain from witnessing it were greater than his physical suffering. Yet this was never a disorder that actually appeared in the DSM-5, but it could explain why this scene is quite agonizing for many viewers. After the eclipse event, Guts loses his family again. The person he loves is completely different, and the responsible one was his former best friend, and his body was mutilated. It's evident how Guts is left ungrounded at that moment, and once again decides to seek answers. That was his way of dealing with it. So much so that Godot tells him, hate is a place for the man who cannot bear sadness. Guts starts to develop a pessimistic view of life. And it's no wonder, right? The philosopher Seneca said that we are slaves to what we fear losing. So Guts begins to not care about anyone else. And with a devastating feeling of revenge towards Griffith, he starts to convince himself that the defenseless die because they deserve to die, because they are weak. He kind of creates this perspective to shirk more responsibilities because he couldn't take it anymore. He could never trust anyone, and when he starts to trust people, he loses all of them. And the responsible one was one of the people he cherished most. This marks the beginning of the Black Swordsman's cycle of revenge. Although it's often said that revenge is simply something bad that we shouldn't have, some studies show that, it's not that simple. Years ago, a group of Swiss researchers examined the brains of people who were wronged during an economic exchange game. The people had trusted money to their partners only to find out they had been betrayed. The researchers then gave the people the chance to punish their greedy partners, and for an entire minute, while the victims thought about revenge, their brain activity was recorded. The decision triggered a surge of neural activity in the caudate nucleus, a part of the brain known for processing rewards. But the actual execution of revenge comes with a bitter cost of time, emotional energy, physical strain, and even lives. That minute before revenge feels sweet, but what about the days and weeks that follow the event? People make significant mistakes in predicting how they will feel about something in the future. The problem lies in the rumination that lingers in the Avenger's mind. It's as if it continuously hurts the person, to the point where Guts admires Rickert for overcoming it, dealing with it differently, and not escaping from these feelings, like Guts ended up doing. Elfpuck becomes Guts' great link to humanity, just as Chich was for him in childhood. When I read this part of the manga, I thought Guts might corrupt at this point, as he begins to kill and enjoy doing it. But that's not what happens. There is a subtle maturity in him, and he manages to stay strong, though increasingly exhausted. When he returns near Casca and realizes how much she fears him, he says he's exhausted, that the sword he holds has never been so heavy. People who have experienced traumatic events often have sensorial memories of the event. Charles Myers, a psychologist who consulted for the British armies in France, coined the term shell shock, referring to the psychological damage humans face when subjected to prolonged exposure to highly stressful combat situations, such as wars with extreme levels of violence. It is characterized by symptoms like high degrees of fear, hypersensitivity, and a general inability to maintain normal mental state. Guts barely managed to handle the traumas of his childhood and ended up with new traumas. That's one of the reasons he can't see Casca, who was there all along. He basically changes his perspective when he realizes he's about to lose her. And it's interesting that on this journey, he meets people who change his perception and who are impacted by him as well, such as Farnese, who becomes the great protector of Casca, her main caregiver, and Isidoro, who seems to be the child version of Guts, but one who hasn't endured the same suffering he has. Isidoro fights, faces difficult situations, but he has time to play, to dream, something Guts has never been able to do. And the most interesting thing is that the only person who manages to bring him back is Shirke. She is the one who can see Guts' aura. She brings him back from the effects of the Berserker armor. An armor that makes him confront directly with his inner self. The dynamics of this armor resemble the shadow concept created by psychoanalyst Jung. He introduced it in the book Memories, Dreams, Reflections. The shadow is that part we hide. German psychologist Mario Goldwitzer observed what he called the understanding hypothesis, which maintains that the suffering of an offender is not enough by itself to achieve truly satisfying revenge. Instead, the avenger must ensure that the offender makes a direct connection between the retaliation and the initial behavior. Theoretically, for Guts, he needed Griffith to feel that he was indeed being wronged at that moment, and that justice was being served. But the understanding of what is right and what is wrong for both is different. Social psychologist Roy Baumeister says that traitors tend to minimize the damage they have caused, while the betrayed tend to maximize their own suffering. Thus, the betrayed party experiences much more pain and suffering than the traitor believes is fair and reasonable. This perceptual incompatibility leads to endless cycles of revenge. Guts begins to realize this and sees that revenge was doing him tremendous harm, that he was losing energy and his connection with the person he loved, precisely because of this feeling. So much so that Guts accepts help from Farnese and Serpico, because at that moment he was desperate. He didn't know how to handle Casca. He couldn't handle himself. How could he handle the person he loved who was going through a difficult situation? And he realizes that even being extremely strong, he can't handle everything alone. He has the strength that none of his companions have. Maybe Shirky does, right? But he can't handle his emotional issues, which is completely normal for someone who has suffered all his life. And despite everything he's been through, he remains loyal to the people he trusts, so much that he is willing to sacrifice himself for them. That phrase I mentioned at the beginning of the video, "There is no paradise to escape to," that Guts says to Jill, reflects what this character has been struggling with throughout the story. At this point, a change begins, and he starts to face his emotions, to confront them. Guts thought that escaping them would help him, and that didn't happen. Avoiding them made him drift further from what really mattered to him. That's why it's an extremely touching moment when he realizes he's giving up revenge and focusing on what was right there in front of him all along. But of course, how would he see this beauty when he's never seen it since birth? How would he truly know what this beauty was? But this is not limited to Guts, as we all at some point only realize what truly matters too late. Like, subscribe, share, it's just the beginning.